Good evening. It's great to be back. This evening I want to round out this modest little group of talks about Beethoven's relationship to the violin by focusing on two collaborations with people which were not long-lived. But to start that off, I'm going to play something which you may or may not have heard before. So I'll play it first and then talk about it. I think the reason I want to play it is that the thing which I've been talking about the whole time and which is incredibly important to me is the subtlety of Beethoven's relationship with the instrument, and something which might sound a little strange, which is that my contention that this relationship, technical relationship and manual relationship with the instrument, was lifelong, not some kind of distancing, which is often talked about. I'll play it first and then talk about it. So that's really a piece of nothing, a real petit rien, but we know that it was written by Beethoven on the 3rd of August, 1825, and put in the album of a visitor to him in Vienna. Two things excite me about that. Obviously, there's a thing which everybody who loves the late works will immediately recognize, this extraordinary sort of poise, which, whether you're thinking of the late bagatelles or the piece which Beethoven was just about to write, the Opus 132 Quartet, which of course is in basically the same tonal area as what you've just heard. This extraordinary refinement of his approach to the instrument. I think one of the big problems we have in terms of the way that Beethoven has been talked about in the popular sphere is of this kind of, tearing down the houses, raging against heaven kind of thing. But anybody who's played any of the quartets, particularly if you think about Beethoven in the mid-1820s, will know you have that incredible fury, but at the same time, he was about to write with all of its extraordinary relationship to the Ninth Symphony. There's some talk about whether or not actually that originally was going to be a trial run for the Ninth Symphony. So another thing to point out, that for a long time that piece was talked about as being, maybe for two violins or maybe for piano. But the interesting thing, as you can see, is it's a canon for one violin. It fits on the instrument. And this is written by somebody who knows what can be achieved with very little from a deeply integrated approach to the violin. So now we're going to jump back to 1803 and get into it. This is a Mercure de France, reviewing the first appearance of George Auguste Polgrin-Bridgetower in a concert spirituel in Paris on the 13th of April, 1789. A curious debut, which aroused much interest, was that of Monsieur Bridgetower, a young black man from the colonies who played several concertos for the violin with a neatness, a facility, and an execution, and even a sensibility which are rarely met with at so tender an age. He is not yet 10 years old. His talent, as genuine as it is precocious, provides one of the best answers that one can make to the philosophers who would deny to those of his nation and of his colour the faculty of distinguishing themselves in the arts. Now, Bridgetower, of course, was a British national, but of a somewhat mysterious Polish ancestry and African ancestry. We know that his father was the personal page to Prince Nicholas Esterhazy, and he made his first appearance as a soloist on April the 13th. This is the concert you're just hearing about at the Concert Spirituel in Paris, billed rather romantically as the son of an Abyssinian prince, which he was not. Typically, for the time, as can be seen from the review, his age was misrepresented. Same humiliation which had been visited on the young Beethoven by his dreadful father. And come the revolution, a few months later, he came to England, where he studied with various other people. Mozart's student, Thomas Attwood, who'd become the director of music and the organist at St Paul's Cathedral. And on the 2nd of June, 1790, in London, he gave a joint concert with the actual 10-year-old Franz Clement. And part of the concert, as well as even the concert together, as this was actually talked about, was that they assisted Thomas Attwood by sitting on either side of him and doing the registrations for him at the organ as part of the performance, which I think is really charming. And of course, Clement later on is going to premiere Beethoven's Violin Concerto and led all the early performances of the Eroica Symphony, Opus 55, which Beethoven would later be sketching out whilst he was working on the Sonata, which is the focus of our view for the first bit of this little talk. Now, Bridgetower soon found himself working as a violinist, a solo violinist, for George, Prince of Wales in Brighton. And I will come back to the Brighton thing later. Now, of course, famously, Bridgetower found his way to Vienna. I'll get into the detail of that later as well. I keep jumping, I know. But there's an interesting parallel, I think, between Bridgetower's trip to Vienna and Beethoven's own trip in 1792. As famously, Beethoven's patron in Bonn, Count von Waldstein, sent him with this incredibly insulting letter to Haydn, saying that he was to receive the spirit of Mozart from the hands of Haydn, which imperiled Beethoven's relationship with Haydn permanently from then on, basically. Haydn really never forgave him for showing him that. And to bring it gloriously back to his employer's court, back to Bonn. And of course, for all kinds of reasons, mainly the war, of course, but others as well, Beethoven never went back. And like him, Bridgetower never went back to his employer. But more about that later. Now, the short, very tempestuous relationship between Bridgetower and Beethoven resulted, of course, in the composition of the Sonata, Opus 47, which we now call the Kreutzer Sonata. Originally dedicated to Beethoven, to Bridgetower, and the two premiered the work on 24th of May 1803 in the Augarten. That much we know from the dedication on the Vorautograph, with a pre-autograph manuscript, which you can see in the collection of the Beethoven House in Bonn. We know very little of the working relationship between Beethoven and this British violinist, but we do know one particular detail which I'm going to get to. It's very likely that the cause of their meeting was Franz Clement, who, as I mentioned, Bridgetower had known since his time in London, because by this point Clement was sharing apartments with Beethoven in Schickenader's Theatre an der Wien, where obviously Beethoven was employed to try and produce something he had no intention of producing correctly, the Vestas for. He was basically, Schickenader wanted him to produce just as successful a piece of music as the Magic Flute, albeit with more explosions and more wizards. I mean, there were specific requirements on the amount of magic and special effects there were going to be in this thing, and Beethoven found himself ever more constrained and trammeled by the whole thing. The relationship, the friendship between Bridgetower and Beethoven foundered as soon as it began, pretty much. Bridgetower said that it was because of a disagreement over a woman. Most likely, their equally fiery temperaments were the cause of the parting. The Vorautograph, that pre-manuscript, breaks off halfway through the first movement and is in Beethoven's sketchiest hand, as if written in some haste. Now, perhaps either Beethoven had to work up the sonata from sketches to his first rehearsal, or that speaks something of the way that the piece was constructed. And I've been going on a lot about the relationship of all of this work to improvisation. And a little bit of a record which Bridgetower gives us about this gives us a clue. I'm just going to briefly screen share and show you something which will help. Let's just go to this. I just check the screen sharing is working. Are we... that, okay. Sorry, this is... So if you look... No, I don't have what I need, so I'm not going to. But I'm going to put this up anyway. Okay. Let's just put it like that. Okay. The manuscript doesn't include any cadenza material in the first movement. As you may remember, halfway through, well, a third of the way into the exposition, there's a big piano cadenza, which kind of does this. Now, Bridgetower clarifies the point of why that's there, and more to the point, why it only happens in the piano. This is from an inscription in Bridgetower's own copy of the published British publication of the sonata, which was never dedicated to him, published by Birchall. He wrote into his copy, "When I accompanied Beethoven in this concerted sonata in Vienna, I altered, during the repeat of the first part of the presto, the run of bar 18 of the pianoforte part of this movement in the following way." So you just heard the piano part, and he played this. Beethoven, he says, he leaped out of his seat, embraced me, and said, "Once more, dear boy." Then he held down the piano, sorry, that's not his name, and during this run on the note of C until the 9th bar, which meant that he played, effectively, you imagine Bridgetower standing right next to the piano, Beethoven held the bottom C. Now, that, of course, never found its way into the published version. We have this very strange thing where a sonata which begins with a solo violin in the published version has the piano playing the same cadenza twice, both in the exposition and the repeated exposition, which, let's be honest about it, that's completely rubbish. And there's no way that any improvising player at the beginning of the 19th century would ever play it. And I certainly will never allow any pianist to walk over, "I'm playing this every time I play it." Anyone who tries to argue with me is not going to win. Interestingly, a little charming detail was that Bridgetower notated that in English, but of course the Germans, being German, were very concerned that we should think that he said "noch einmal mein lieber Bursch" to Bridgetower. The first time I read it, it was in a German account, and I spent some time translating that before it dawned on me, hey, there's no reason why that would have been in German. It's worth saying that Carl Czerny, who was studying with Beethoven at that point, recalled that Bridgetower's playing used to make him laugh out loud. We'll come away from the screen share for a bit. So perhaps this was the only time, maybe, that Beethoven worked with a string player who, however briefly, he regarded as a peer, whether as friend or artist. The original dedication on the sonata is both affectionate, mocking, and to our ears, abominably racist. I read it out with temerity and with multiple warnings. Sonata mulattica, composta per il mulatto Bridgetower, gran pazzo e compositore mulattica. Mulatto sonata composed for mulatto Bridgetower, the great madman and mulatto composer, the great lunatic, gran pazzo. That is the language of the day, and that's one of the most, by Beethoven's standards, one of the most genuine and affectionate dedications he ever gave to anybody, but it never found its way anywhere close to the publication. Now, Beethoven's attitude to improvisation and ornamentation was incredibly inconsistent. He often shocked and even angered his colleagues by inserting unexpected and unwanted cadenzas into his chamber music. The premiere of the Opus 16 Quintet, which some of us will know as the Piano Quartet, which curiously the premiere was given in a hybrid version where we know that both Schuppanzig, violinist, and Punto, the horn player, were playing in that first performance, which means somehow a group of musicians managed to jemmy together the piano quartet version and the piano quintet version with wind and play it in the same space. And in the middle of the performance, Beethoven played a quarter of an hour long cadenza, which offended Punto, the horn player, so much that he walked off stage in protest. But he also remonstrated with junior colleagues, such as his pupils Carl Czerny and Ries, for taking precisely the same liberties that had brought him fame with the same pieces. So, and if you look at the first edition of the sonata, on all subsequent editions, you'll find no violin cadenza, where Bridgetower, and he would have no reason to exaggerate this, and this seems completely believable to me, and is exactly the kind of thing I'd expect to be going on between these two. Later on, I'm going to come to something of what I think happened with the beginning of that sonata and why it looks and sounds like it did. But I will return to that when I get into some really nerdy detail in a couple of minutes. Now, of course, by the time it came to publish, Beethoven had changed the dedication to the great French virtuoso and great composer, Rodolphe Kreutzer. who never performed it and was later, just to get this into context, much later seen running from a performance in France of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony with his hands over his ears. So Kreutzer was never likely to be playing the Kreutzer Sonata. Now, this is where it gets shady. Rodolph Kreutzer met Haydn. Sorry, Rodolph Kreutzer met... I don't want to read that as Haydn. Rodolph Kreutzer met Beethoven in 1798. And here gets into a little bit of the relationship between Beethoven and the wheels within wheels of power. Beethoven noted in February 1798 when he met him that Kreutzer was, quote, a dear, kind fellow who during his stay in Vienna has given me a great deal of pleasure. On the published version of the sonata, which was published very fast by the standards of the day, in 1805, it was inscribed to this French disciple of Viotti in quite obsequious terms. Al suo amico, il membro del Conservatorio di Musica in Parigi, primo violino dell'Accademia dell'Arte e del Camera Imperiale, so member of the Conservatoire of Paris in Paris, first violin of the Academy of Arts. I don't know quite what that means. I think they've made that up. There was no such position. And member of the Imperial Camera, a group of musicians around the emperor. This was true. Now, it's worth noting why Kreutzer was in Paris when he was, and observe without judgment too much, Beethoven quietly judging friendships and collaborations with musicians very close to centres of power on both sides of the tragic conflict was going on, because, don't forget, the Bridge Tower was the personal violinist to the Prince Regent in the UK. And here's where it gets dodgy, dare I say. On the 5th of February, 1798, the reason that Kreutzer was there was because he was the personal violinist of Napoleon's General Bernadotte, who just arrived in the imperial capital as a very short-lived ambassador. There's much speculation about the purpose of the visit, and buried in the public to and froing and agreements and, possible truces was the real reason for the visit. What would happen if, when it happened, Vienna was besieged and invested? And this happened in advance of all sieges. And you'll see it wasn't just the French who did this. Various options would have been discussed behind closed doors. Resistance, futile resistance to the Grande Armée, which has been renamed that, leading to bloody defeat and the horror of a rapacious army going through the streets of Vienna. Second, surrender or truce with no resistance and thus no honour. Or partial symbolic resistance and controlled bombardment, living to surrender with honour. And anybody who knows what happened in 1809 and knows the story of Beethoven in the cellar with the pillows over his ears as the shells went over his head, shelling a pit of the city which the Habsburgs weren't terribly interested in keeping neat, will know what the decision had been. And to be honest, 2 years earlier, in 1807, the same agreement was made between the English and the Danes. So when the English arrived in Copenhagen in 1807 and attacked it with rockets, which was their first go at using these before they used them to burn down Washington a few years later, Copenhagen was the trial run, the city was carefully shelled, Copenhagen was carefully shelled, knocking down two things. The old medieval palace, which later was rebuilt as the Parliament building, and the crumbling slums around Højbrodsplatz, which nobody, if the upper classes in Copenhagen, would ever be seen dead in. The rest of the city was left relatively unscathed, whilst this horror of 10,000 rockets into the city went into this very precise area. But Beethoven is very close to the people who were negotiating these things, and Kreutzer was the personal violinist to Bernadotte. But Bernadotte had miscalculated the tenor of the situation in Vienna. He'd established his embassy in the Palace Capraro Gaimola in Valna Street, on the 13th of April. And later that month, he decided to hoist an early version of the French tricolour on the balcony. And a mob rapidly gathered, demanding the flag be removed. Because it's pretty stupid. The Vinnies were not going to forget that 6 years earlier, the French had guillotined the Archduchess Maria Antonia Josefa Johann, who we know better as Marie Antoinette, who was the daughter of the Empress Maria Theresa, ruler of the Habsburg Empire, and her husband Francis I, the Holy Roman Emperor. Bernadotte had to leave immediately, albeit with a very carefully staged formal farewell, and to this day, the nearby road is known as Farngasse, Flag Street. So that's the reason that Kreutzer was there. But I'd like to get a little bit more complicated. Now, you're going to have to humour me for the next 5 minutes if I go into deep nerd territory. I have been thinking for years, and I said this earlier, rationalising what it was that meant that a sonata based on this material would begin like this. And of course answered by the piano in the minor. Now remember, I've been talking about improvising, and it's very clear from a number of major works which appear around about this time, leading up to the most contentious one, about which I barely want to speak in public because it gets me in such trouble when I do, the Schubert Fantasy, that my contention is these were pieces which resulted from initially from shared acts of improvisation between musicians. And if you think of the dispensation of the opening of that, imagine the Beethoven saying to his friend, okay, let's improvise, you go first, and then I'll do something. And of course it finds its way through semitones to that first theme, naturally, in kind of backwards in the way he finds his way to the last movement theme of the First Symphony, for instance, building it up in increments. But that's improvisation. And I wonder, to a degree, if whether or not the origin of the sonata itself was them improvising together. And the real smoking gun, which I'm not going to get to textually at all today, is the variations, where you have after the piano playing, answered by the violin doing it, and of course, because the piano had started, the Beethoven plays the first variation, and then you have something which is one of the most simplistic bits of violin writing in all Beethoven. For the life of me, I'm convinced, and particularly the bowing says to me that this is maybe something which Beethoven said, I'll do, but what are you going to do? At the very least, that sounds like him crystallizing something which an improvising player would do. I'm just going to put that there. And linked to this is the question of what did Bridgetower bring with him? Why do we suddenly get a sonata concertante? Why is it suddenly broken? Why the whole accompanied piano sonata is gone, and suddenly we get literally, effectively, a concerto for two equal instruments? Reversing a little bit, I would suggest that one of the reasons is a piece which we know that Bridgetower had played, he premiered, and this was, I'm trying to find my share screen, this was Samuel Wesley's Sonata Concertante. I'm trying to get this out of the way, go away. There we go, okay, here we go. Which I want to show you this. So, sorry about this messy screen sharing going on today, but this is how it's going to be. So if I just do this. Okay, that's quite so you've seen him. This is the beginning of a sonata by Samuel Wesley, described as a sonata concertante, which had been finished in the spring of 1797. It's nowhere close to being as ambitious as anything Beethoven would write, but interestingly, both the first movement and the second movement begin with the violin alone. Now, someone's going to point out the thing that some of you, I'm sure, will know, which is that Beethoven had written one accompanied piano sonata which begins with the accompanying instrument. That's the Horn Sonata, Opus 17, which plenty of viola players, violin, cellists, and in my case violinists have played, which begins bum ba da bum bim bum, with the solo horn. But in many ways that was more to do with the fact of the horn signal which you'd expect. I suspect that in part of their conversations, about what they were going to do. Musicians and composers often sit down and say, what are we going to do together? Bang it around and think, I've had this conversation with so many composers. And I just wonder whether Bridgetower said, because any traveling musician took stuff with them, pulled it out of his case and said, have a look at this. And Beethoven probably would have said, well, I'm not playing that. But it might have just niggled with him. And that could be, we have no more evidence than that. However, there is something else. And a few years ago, the pianist Roy Howard handed me a pile of photocopies of letters between Bridgetower, Samuel Wesley, and Novello. I won't take you into them in any detail, except to say that what these reveal is an argument going on between Bridgetower and Wesley about who had the samizdat copy of the Bach sonatas and partitas, because he wanted Bridgetower to play them at an evening concert of Purcell and Handel and Bach, and the highlight would be Bridgetower playing the 3 fugues from the sonatas and partitas and the chaconne. That was going to be the highlight of the evening. And what was being discussed was that whilst Wesley knew where his copy of the first edition, which interestingly was published by Beethoven's Bonn publisher Nicholas Simrock in 1802, what he really wanted was the handwritten copy, and I love this, that had been given to him, wait for it, by Johann Peter Salomon. The Salomon, the man who brought Haydn to London, had given Wesley, early in the 1790s, a copied out copy of the Bach sonatas and partitas. Now, the old saw, which thankfully has begun to die now, was that it's still in the front pages of one edition of the Bach sonatas and partitas, was that they were unknown in the 19th century, and then they were found wrapped around butter and all this kind of thing, and they weren't played until Joachim played them, which is rubbish of the highest degree, because anyone who knows their Quartet, the great manual for the violin published in the 1790s, will find that the last example that he gives, and I said it the other day, is the glorious still together today, possibly the most joyful piece ever written for the violin alone. And it was already by this point had become a kind of calling card to show that you were a serious musician. The reason, and this is the fun bit, and this is so nerdy, I believe I'm going to say it. The reason he was worried was because he knew that if he didn't have 2 copies, it would be very difficult for Bridgetower to play these pieces without someone turning pages for the whole time. The whole point was that he wanted to have the Simrock copy and the handwritten copy there so that he could play the fugue without page turns. Now, I'm old enough to remember the fact that when I first studied Histoire du Soldat, which has got nothing to do with this talk whatsoever, with the great Manu Prican, who'd studied it and played it under Stravinsky and recorded it in the great recording with Markievicz and Maurice Andre and Jean Cocteau narrating, that when he handed me his copy, he had written out the pages where the page turns didn't work because he was too old to have grown up with photocopies. Writing music out was a vital activity, and there were, not surprising, great arguments about who had copies. And if you're going to play music where you didn't want the photocopies to happen, or not photocopies, didn't want page turns to interrupt them, you needed handwritten copies. So that's the reason for what Wesley described as his great tribulation. Anyway, we're going to escape from that and get now to Opus 96. I'm going to come back to Opus 47 at the end for a good reason, the kind of the playful bit of this to finish with. Now, the Opus 96 Sonata was the last work for violin which with piano accompaniment, which Beethoven completed. Now, he dedicated it to his friend and confidant, the Archduke Rudolph. Let's give the Archduke Rudolph his moment in the sun. Here we go. Or we will do it for you. There he is. It's worth remembering that the Archduke was an extraordinary musician. He premiered the triple concerto as pianist at the age of 16. And also, on top of it, he was an art enthusiast. This is the person who, by the time Beethoven wrote this piece, owns the greatest Titian painting of the flaying of Marsyas. You know, if anyone has seen that. And one of the things I really love is if you think of the amateur musicians, the amateurs who Beethoven was around, and look at what they were collecting. Beethoven was witness to some of the greatest works of art. So you have the Archduke Rudolph, who's not just a great musician and a cleric. He also is collecting Titian. And on the other side, you have the Fries family who were commissioning and collecting Canova. So he was in touch with people who were collecting the most modern art and the greatest Renaissance art. And I think it's worth pointing out that Beethoven, because of his education in Bonn, was somebody who was acutely sensitive to all of these kind of things. Let's get out of the chat. Now, it was the Archduke who, in collaboration with the Princess Kinsky and Lobkowitz, provided Beethoven an annuity in 1809, which persuaded him to stay in Vienna. Now, this sonata, the Opus 96, was premiered on the 29th of December, or sort of premiered in the 29th of December, in a private concert the Archduke gave with the great Pierrot, the great French virtuoso, in the Lobkowitz Palace. The public premiere took place on the 7th of January 1813. It's worth just putting a pin in that, because by this point it becomes evident that it become entrenched in Beethoven's practice that there will be salon workshop premieres of pieces, followed by short periods of experimentation leading up to public premieres to which the critics would be invited. By the time we get to the September of 1825, this is absolutely documented, but that makes good sense that this is what they found themselves doing over the new year. The first edition of the sonata appeared in 1816 and a London edition the same year. It's worth us taking a moment to think about Rode. Of course, he was one of the great disciples of Viotti. He'd been appointed Napoleon Bonaparte's solo violinist in 1800 before making the unwise decision he was sent in 1803, part of the agreement between the treaty between Napoleon and Alexander I, who I was talking about in my previous talk. He went to St. Petersburg along with the cellist Jacques Michel Hurel Lama and the composer François-Adrien Boidieu. It's worth saying that just an illustration of the vicissitudes of being around this kind of environment was that whilst Rode left in 1808, Boidieu stayed, and it became very awkward when the Tsar declared war on France, on Napoleon, who'd sent him there. And it became even more awkward when Boidieu, who was suspected of being a spy, and his post was opened, and when the police opened a piece of music, they found a piece of music beginning with the notes si, mi, sol. And these words si, mi, sol were read as 6,000 soldats, 6,000 soldiers. And the composer was immediately accused of using music as espionage. Interestingly, in the 20th century, the same thing briefly happened to Penderecki with the score of the Threnody for the Victors of Hiroshima, which was accused briefly by customs officials of being the plans for maybe a rocket or a secret piece of military hardware, which you've seen the score. It's not entirely surprising. When Rode came back in 1808, however, he came back, and it was rumoured broken by 5 stressful years and the kind of intrigues and cabals of the Russian court. And the rumour had spread that it had broken his spirit and his playing. So back to 1812, when this sonata starts to appear. There's a bit of an irony here, that whilst our Habsburg Archduke cleric was playing very careful politics in a concert with this Napoleon's violinist, at the same moment, this is the winter of 1812, the Grande Armée, the largest military force ever assembled at that point, was freezing to death, being picked off by marauders in the snows of Russia and then Lithuania. When they arrived on the Prussian border, they'd been reduced to a few thousand men and 60 horses. Meanwhile, Napoleon, who refused to accept he was defeated, was sending orders ahead as to what operas and ballets should be played in Paris to celebrate his victorious return. But of course, Beethoven was not above politicking. The fact that he was negotiating effectively by the rededication of the Kreutzer Sonata, that definitely was that. This concert can be seen as a step on him establishing himself as the first composer in residence to a peace conference. Because when the Congress of Vienna happened in 1814 to 1815, that anchors Beethoven on the international stage, and he produced, of course, his worst piece of music, the quite dreadful Glorreicher Augenblick, which, I love Beethoven, but I do not ever need to hear that ever again. Now, we have no evidence as to why it was decided to play a concert with Rode, but plenty that both Rudolph and Beethoven became increasingly anxious about this choice of string player. Of course, making links with the French musical establishment in some ways was the wisest decision Beethoven ever made, because it's with Paris where the earliest societies were found specifically to perform his music, right back in the first decade of the 1800s, where François-Antoine Abenek founded initially what were called les exercices in the Paris Conservatoire, which morphed into being the Société de Concert, which ended up giving the first truly great performances of the Eroica Symphony, for instance. And over successive decades, it leads all the way up, for instance, to musicians such as Jean-Pierre Marin, who would found in the end of the 1830s the first string quartet in the world which only played Beethoven quartets. Chopin's quartet wasn't that. They played Schubert and Hummel and Ebel, whatever else. And it was in Paris where Rhodes collaborated in 1803 with Kreutzer and Baillot on the original method. But in 1834, when Habeneck published his own L'Art du Violon, this is the first violin method to recommend a systematic study of Beethoven, including one Beethoven fingering, which is, curiously, the only fingering he recommends is for a portion of a transcription of the horn sonata. Or he recommends imitating the sound of hand stopping on the horn by playing this fingering. A 1-1-1 fingering. He does talk about how important it is to play Beethoven, but it happens seriously in Paris. There's one thing to talk about here is links across Europe during the conflict. And I will get to one aspect of that later. But of course, one of the interesting things is when, after 1794 in particular, war overtook the whole of Europe, it both shut down and facilitated links between places. So it meant, from until 1809, when the Viennese capital fell, there was no useful link between Paris and Vienna. So in terms of, say, instrument technology, say the Tourte bow, we're pretty sure that the Tourte bow wasn't available in Paris until then, although there were imitations had been made. And it's also worth pointing out that even if they'd got there, the fundamental difference of the bow we use, calling a Tourte bow now, as well as the convex stick, is the thing we think the least about, which is, this is being really nerdy, the closed ferrule. The fact that the hair is not open to the back here, but it's closed there, which would enable in the 20th century a whole school of American string playing to evolve, which does this. Now, that's not possible with an open ferrule because the hair moves around too much. So the closed ferrule seems to have appeared in Paris around about 1803 or 1804, and that brings a level of development into the Tourte bow initially for what it was. It wasn't designed for that. Tourte brings that in late. So whilst we're pretty sure, for instance, that Mozart has access to early versions, the version we use now was not available in Vienna until 1809. And just to put this into really sharp focus, we know this because the first French musician to seriously arrive in Vienna and work there seriously and to work with the musicians after 1809, during 1809, was Pierre Baillot, who arrived to talk about Parisian music making, and I love this one. He arrived to ask Haydn, before he died, what the correct speeds were for slow movements of his symphonies. Because there was great consternation in Paris as to, surely they can't be that slow. And so Baillot came with a metronome, he went to Haydn and said, I'm pretty sure all these movements should be really fast. And Haydn agreed with him. And Baillot, this is not making this up, was so excited, he leapt into Haydn's lap and knocked out the remainder of his teeth. It's documented on both sides. Poor Haydn. They got on well despite that. And we know it was round about that time that Baillot met Beethoven. More interchange happened. But in 1812, Beethoven was very concerned about the prospect of working with this unknown eminence grise, because he wasn't in the habit of collaborating with musicians not part of his circle. And he hadn't had that. He was going to write a piece of music for somebody he'd not met. It's clear from his work with Kreutzer they met, they decided to do something, they hung out on a piece of merchandise. Here the plan was that Rode was going to arrive in December, and Beethoven would have material ready for him, they'd rehearse it and they'd play it. Beethoven did not do that. He had good reason to be worried. Letters from the Archduke Rudolph warned him that Rode was increasingly past his prime. Beethoven, some of you will know, was taking ever greater care to ensure the performance of his chamber music were at the highest level. In 1825, concerned at Schuppanzig's lack of technical control, he went as far as forcing him and his colleagues to sign an ersatz contract in which they promised to practice their parts for the premiere of the E-flat string quartet. This didn't work. The first performance was a disaster, and Beethoven, who was ready for this, had organised a second first performance led by the young Joseph Böhm, who of course was Rode's pupil, which was more successful. And that rehearsals for that are going to appear a little bit later. Joseph Meyerbeer, the composer, who heard Rode in Paris 1 month before the Vienna concert, observed the falling off audible in his playing. He wrote, "In November, Pierre Rode came and played at court and gave a public concert. His beautiful tone is the same as it was 10 years ago. On that occasion, however, I found greater passion and warmth in his playing. It has been left or replaced with a dubious correctness that left me quite cold. The reception and opinions of this were much divided." It was regularly alleged during the 19th century that this the Opus 50 F major Romance was written for Rode. Now, there's no documentary evidence for this whatsoever. However, the style of Beethoven's writing, both in that and in the other romance, the style of those is overtly Parisian, this kind of idea of the grandeur of long bowing. So it's pretty clear that Beethoven was aware of this kind of beautifully even bowing and long lines championed by Viotti's disciples. It's surprising. It wouldn't be surprising if the romance had been at least thought of as for one of them. We know nothing more than that. It's worth saying that 8 years later, Paganini heard Rode in Rome. This 8 years after Beethoven was worried. He was tremendously impressed. He wrote, and Paganini was not usually impressed by other violinists, he wrote that Rode was the monarch of variety, even in the antechamber of paradise. It could not sound better than he. It's worth remembering that on his deathbed, Paganini whispered to his one pupil, Camillo Severi. He pulled him over and said, "Go to Paris. Paris. After Paris, there is nothing." But even in his mind, Paris was the epitome of music making. Now, the main issue for Beethoven and his royal people was the veteran violinist's right hand, his bowing arm. He suffered from something called St. Anthony's fire, which may be erysipelas. I mean, it was so called St. Anthony's fire because the saint was invoked by those suffering from it, and it seems to have given him a degree of paralysis. And Rode's friends were very concerned for him, and as early as 1802, Pierre Baillot wrote of the effect the disease was having on his friend psychologically. But this is where it gets interesting. Here's a letter, early December 1812, to Rudolph. "Tomorrow, very early, the copyist will be here to begin the last movement. As I meanwhile am writing several other works, I have not hastened much with this last movement for the sake of mere punctuality, and all the more as in writing it, I must take into account Rode's style of playing. We are fond of rushing passages in our finales, but that does not suit Rode, which troubles me. Everything else will go to plan." The result was extraordinary, almost unprecedented within Beethoven's oeuvre, a sonata specifically tailored not only to the requirements, but the limitations of its intended performer. I'm going to get back to the result in terms of the last movement in a minute. But there's another thing he did which has not been observed. Violinists in the room will know that the biggest fight between violinists is what you do with the beginning of the piece. I'm just going to screen share again because literally blood has been spilled over this. Let's get this thing up. So here's the first page. This is from the glorious manuscript. This lovely even from the very beginning, you can see this long sweeping lines, which, he's trying to fit it to the French style. But there's something more. The thing which every violinist worries about, do you play or... And everybody disagrees about this. But the thing which interested me was, why was it there in the first place? Just before I talk about that, look at the date on the top right-hand corner in Beethoven's handwriting, 1812 into 1813. He's even notated the fact that the manuscript is finished primarily in the winter, in December 1812, and he's still working on it in January 1813. He's notated that workshop period here. But the reason, I'm not going to show you the score which this has is yet, because I don't want to pull the rabbit out of the hat I'm proud of this, and it may be total rubbish, so try it out for this evening. In 1794, a performance was given by Pierre Rode of a new piece, which was perhaps over the next 25, 30 years, the most influential piece of violin writing ever written. So much so that by the 1810s, singers were singing it, and by the 1820s, pianists were making transcriptions of the sung version of it. So we know that Angelica Catalani sung this, and we know that Johann Baptist Kramer made transcriptions, he was not the only one, for piano, of Catalani's transcription of this. So this is the beginning of the first of Pierre Rode's Air Verrier, premiered in 1794. If I just play you the beginning. Now, it's absolutely nothing, but the fact that the very first notes of Beethoven that Pierre Rode found himself playing was the ictus, the beginning of his most famous piece. It also provides an answer as to whether Beethoven wanted to turn on that first trill. It's an incredibly delicate gesture from a composer to a player, a little gesture of a reverence, you might see it, a doffing of the hat to this musician, perhaps to make sure that when they got together, there wouldn't be any of those awkward moments that can happen between composers and performers when they work together for the first time. It's also... So this is this only documented case we have of Beethoven actually adjusting speed indication in advance of a performance. So this is the beginning of the last movement, for instance, here. If you think of the last movement of the other Beethoven sonata in G major, which we were talking about the other day for piano and violin, and he'd basically been told he couldn't do any of that stuff. Rode couldn't do it because of his disability, and also he didn't like it. So the beginning of the last movement begins with the piano, and this, down, etc., etc. It's worth saying that I said I was going to talk about Joseph Boehm a little bit. We do know that in those, that we have one documentation of Beethoven agreeing to change a speed in a rehearsal for a violinist. And that was in the case of the last movement of the Opus 127 quartet, which every violinist absolutely hates playing because it's this. I'm not going to play any more of it today because I haven't practiced it, and it's a total nightmare. And Joseph Boehm said to him, look, this is too fast, and it's ridiculously difficult. And Beethoven took a moment and archly inscribed on it, Allegro commodo, a convenient allegro. Never was a more slightly insulting remark delivered to the violinist, but he did agree to change it. So as Rudolph pointed out, Rode couldn't use any of the fast separate bows, spiccato, staccato, jette, balzato, all the things which actually Beethoven's last movements are full of. He loves very virtuoso fiddle writing in particular in the last movements of his sonatas. Go through them. Even the ones which begin with elegant variations tend to find their way there. And at the same moment that he was writing this, the other works which are on his desk was the Opus 95 Styriozo Quartet, Think of the end of that, that kind of Rossini, proto-Rossini ending. In some ways unforgivable ending. After all that serious quartet, he can't bring himself to stay down in the mire, and he does a kind of this little crazy coda. Rode wouldn't want to do any of that. But it's also worth saying that the adjustments he makes in this piece perhaps give him a clue as to what he could do with sonata finales with string instruments in the future. And perhaps that last movement of the A minor quartet, that lyrical last movement, couldn't have happened. Or even things like the end of the Opus 109 piano sonata without this kind of little discovery. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. This is a full-size facsimile of Beethoven's manuscript. It's an extraordinary manuscript dating from 1812. Incorporating all kinds of things, but the most exciting thing about it, which tells you a great deal about it, is it's in portrait format. All of Beethoven's sonatas for piano with accompaniment up to this point were in landscape format. And the reason this was like this was because, unlike all the others, this manuscript was not going to be played from. Because Beethoven was not going to be the pianist, Rudolph was going to be the pianist. In fact, there's no evidence whatsoever that Beethoven ever performed this piece. This has been designed specifically to be a working score. Now, it's worth saying that at this moment, Beethoven, by this point, had become a master of working with multiple publishers to get them all to publish his works at the same time, somehow under the impression they were all getting exclusivity. This was put together by his somewhat conniving brother, and he got Beethoven to make multiple copies of the works. You'll see why I want to talk about this. Beethoven was not above, in order to get this happen, creating fake manuscripts. And the most famous of these is the manuscripts of the Violin Concerto, of which he made two. And because Beethoven is a deeply sensitive artist, these two versions, neither of them is a fair copy, neither of them is Reinschrift, but both of them are working texts. And there's an obvious reason that he simply couldn't bring himself to work on a score without working on a score. So, for instance, Alan Tyson was the person in the 1970s who pointed out the counter subject in the coda of the first movement of the Violin Concerto, the cellos, which didn't exist in the other version and wasn't played until then. And it was because Beethoven on the London version couldn't resist putting it in. He couldn't bring himself not to be a composer. And for him, copying and transcription and composition were so close to each other, he couldn't disentangle them. Imagine what Busoni's reaction would be. It would be, what on earth did you expect to happen? Busoni repeatedly tells us, you can't disentangle transcription and copying and composition from each other. The composer, the artist, will always do something with their material. But this has ramifications for every Beethoven manuscript that we know. All of them contain, to a greater or a lesser degree, the charge of composer, performer, transcriber. A composer who's constantly reevaluating and interpreting every ink stroke. Now, we can tell that this is not the manuscript given to Rudolph either. Firstly, the shape of the manuscript, which means it wouldn't fit on the forte piano, it will flop over. You had landscapes for playing manuscripts. And just look at the nature of it. I've been sharing the Opus 30s, which are working scores because of the collaborative process, but they began what was given or presented to Schubinzig to work over Beethoven's shoulder as they worked together, was beautifully written out and very neat. This is a beautiful score, but it's beautiful for other reasons, because it actually has Beethoven changing his mind in front of it. This is not, for instance, that's the original version of the trio for the which every violinist knows begins now with the violin playing the tune and then swapping over to the piano. In Beethoven's first pass at it, he begins with the piano and swaps over to the violin. He just writes out the melody of 8 bars on piano, 8 bars on the violin, then thinks better of it. On the next page, writes it out and just crosses it out. He would have never handed that score over to Rudolph. And what you're seeing here is a beautiful, first of all, beautiful act of composition, point one. So there's a few bits of it. But here's the next thing. Imagine the rehearsal processes. Beethoven is not at the piano. And of course, this gives a huge advantage because the big problem, as I keep saying, for everybody at the beginning of the 19th century is if you're working on something in a rehearsal, whether you're an orchestral player or a composer, although graphite pencils had been invented in the 16th century, they were not generally available. What were available were grease pencils, which were only used really around printers. You didn't want to put grease pencil on a copy because it's going to smudge on the opposite page. And of course, pen. And the big problem with pen is, one, you had to use it on a flat surface if you weren't going to make a terrible mess. Two, the ink took 2 or 3 minutes to dry, even when you'd shake and sand all over it. And three, if you're a Beethoven, ink was a great opportunity to make a terrible mess and miscut the nibs and everything. I mean, look at what we're looking at. But here, Beethoven was able to sit, presumably listening, or let's be precise, watching the rehearsal, because by this time he was profoundly deaf, observing the movements of Rode and Rudolph, and at the three of them trying out refinements of syntax and dynamics and notes. And so if you look at the page that I've just given you here, which is from the slow movement, that's sort of what we're seeing. This is where it gets to the thing I love absolutely the most, which is this. Here is almost the very end of the violin part. I'm just going to swing these away because they're slightly in the way. Okay. The last virtuoso flight of the violin, which is smartly imitated by the piano, after a series of sweeping scales, if I slow it down, and I've adjusted the score, so this is actually over 2 lines. I've cut one off and put it so you can see them next to each other. And you can see the collar, if I just show you the collatava marking running up there. So I slow it down is 4/4/4. That's in Beethoven's neatest handwriting. Now, the first thing is I just love to talk about the possibilities. Why is that there? This might have been a technique that Beethoven demanded of Rode, either to introduce kind of energy into the arpeggio, because it's kind of fantastic at speed when you're warmed up. Just driving the fourth finger up the instrument. Certainly from a harmonic point of view, it avoids the dreadful thing which you hear in most performances if you slow it down, where you get the first finger slaps down onto the G. So you get a completely unnatural emphasis on the tonic, which completely ruins the effect of the perfect cadence that follows it, because it's a sospeso, suspended kind of thing. Perhaps it's a fingering that Rode himself suggested. It would be rather a French thing if it was with a French porte de voix, portamento. So it could have been a little whip, 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 going up like that. It's even possible, I've been thinking about these for far too long, I've loved this too much, that it's a reflection of piano fingering. And here I can't resist talking about Chico Marx. Think how Chico Marx did that if he was doing it with the first finger. He'd go, doop, 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 doop. It did that kind of chopping thing on the piano of going down like this. And I have actually persuaded pianists to try it just with the first finger, with the Chico Marx over-fingering. But that kind of energy which Marx gets into the piano playing makes good sense of this if you see it as a gesture. Perhaps it's something he discussed with Rudolph in advance of the rehearsals. What I think is great is that this is one of these places where a door opens for us into the creativity which Beethoven actually demands of us as performers. If he's asking for a fingering like that there, he doesn't want generic fingerings the rest of the time. It's worth pointing out that when I was young, various very important professors showed this to me as an example, wait for it, that Beethoven didn't know anything about violin playing. This was presented as an example of bad practice. So just kind of come out of this, I want to see everybody. So, curiously, Beethoven seemed more than ready to experiment with a sort of interwoven duo writing within this medium of the accompanying form. But it's worth mentioning that one of the problems he ran into was, of course, how do you make something which is both challenging and sellable? And shortly after this time, course, as you know, by this time he was working with Robert Burns's publisher in Scotland, G.S. Thompson, on the folk song transcriptions. And there's a letter from Thompson to Beethoven smartly reproving him for writing piano parts which were far too difficult for amateurs to play, to which Beethoven, who, to be honest, was always ready to make money, and he made more money from Thompson than anybody else, acceded and wrote nice, easy piano parts. And in fact, you can see a direct line through to those nice, easy piano parts, to the simplicity, say, of, imagine the Opus 126 bagatelle, the challenge which Thompson gave him to be simple has great ramifications for the late works. But here, by this point, by 1812, he is writing music for two sets of players and two sets of audiences simultaneously. George Smart, who I mentioned earlier, received a letter from Beethoven accompanying a copy of the score of the Opus 95 quartet, which I've been talking about so much. The wonderful F minor quartet, which is F minor for precisely one bar, one note. The rest of the quartet's not in F minor. I've never understood why it was called F minor, but there you are. And when you hear this letter, you'll see why it has the title Styriozo. He wrote, "Nota bene, this quartet is written for a small circle of connoisseurs and is underlined never to be performed in public." So it's very interesting that there's this kind of balance between things which Beethoven is constructing for the general public and things which are regarded as being too rarefied. And you could see that in the technical requirements of these pieces as well. But now I want to find our way back to Kreutzer through something really charming. The manuscript catalogue of the British Library includes the most bizarre entry. This is the manuscript library. I'm reading exactly. Tuning fork, said to have been given to Beethoven by G.A.P. Bridgetower with related documents and a label in the hand of Gustav Holst. Holst gave it to Vaughan Williams, and his widow Ursula gave it to the library. The object seems insignificant. It's this, and I'm very happy to say I've held this. A small, elegantly crafted tuning fork, smaller than most modern equivalents, nestling on a velvet cushion in a walnut box. Now, let's go back to Bridgetower. As I said, in 1802, George, who was working for the... I'll get out of it. Okay, so I'll get back to that. Where are you? There you are. Was working for the Prince Regent in Brighton, persuaded his royal employer to cross the channel, see his family on the mainland, and meet with musicians in Vienna. This had only become possible because of the cessation of hostilities from March 1802 to 1803, as a result of the Paix d'Amiens, which had been signed by Joseph Bonaparte and Admiral Cornwallis. In addition, the Prince was beginning building work on what was formerly known as the Marine Pavilion to turn it into the wonderful Oriental confection, England's first serious iron-framed building, the thing we now know, which meant that the music room was going to be closed down. There was little point paying his greatest finest to work and sit around waiting to play in the building site. So and also, I think that Bridgetower was pretty keen of finding a way of freeing his way from his royal service without upsetting anybody. And this seemed the obvious way to do it. And he showed no inclination to return. He never went back. Later, of course, the aging Viotti could be found in the music room of the Brighton Pavilion, sitting next to then King George, as one of King George's favoured wind bands honked their way through marches, and George slapped Viotti's thigh. You can imagine this delicate old man sitting next to this extraordinary prince enduring that. What musicians have to put up with when we play ball with nobility. But let's think about the gift of the tuning fork. Now, I like to think that it was both a kind thing, but also in the pugnacious spirit of their friendship. A helpful present disguised as a wry joke about intonation. I'm sure that the two musicians were unable to agree on a standard pitch. Anybody who works across European countries in different groups will have this fight. So I go to Munich quite often, and then it's 4/4-3 there, and you go to Copenhagen, and I was 4/4-5, and I've never forgot the experience of playing the Spring Sonata for the first time, feeling like this. that kind of, almost like it was an F sharp major. And it was awful. And we have terrible fights about this. So it's still an issue. Perhaps the two of them clashed about the pitch of Beethoven's pianos or the state they were in. We know from the earliest accounts that Beethoven's famous disregard for the state of his pianos in Vienna went right back to his time as a teenager in Bonn. There is an account from Anton Reicher, back when they were working together in the Bonn Court Orchestra, of Beethoven playing this with the court orchestra, the K491 Mozart, and hammering the piano so violently that Reicher spent the entire performance not turning pages, but pulling out broken strings, trying to pull broken hammers out of the piano so that Beethoven could go on playing. Beethoven apparently had his head down and didn't notice the apocalypse which was going on inside the piano. This kind of happiness with wanton disrepair of keyboards continued. But it's worth remembering that British pitch was notoriously high at this point. Philharmonic pitch, as it was called, was standardized at 452, which caused great distress to visiting singers. And Michael Costa, who was the director of the Philharmonic Society, insisted on this well into the second half of the 19th century. I own a early 19th century tuning fork right here. So it's show and tell time. Here is my disgusting cork tuner, and here's 440. No, not that. Stop it. You heard the A anyway. Okay? Do it again. There is. No, forget that. A, that. Ready for this? Where's the mic? That's not 452. That's 453. I know, because I tested it. So, there's evidence. I suddenly realised while I was putting this together, I've had this for 20 years. I'll never have been able to put to any use apart from amusing myself in the middle of the night. Tenors who came to London to sing the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven refused to do it at that pitch for all the obvious reasons. So perhaps Beethoven was saying thank you to his friend with a rather big compliment. Remember, he was always meanest and rudest to the people to whom he tried to express affection. And if you think about his knowledge of history, there might be a different narrative here. We don't know whether when the fork was gifted to Bridgetower. Perhaps Beethoven gave it to him in Vienna. Perhaps he sent it with Ferdinand Ries when Ries came to England. And Ries, don't forget, came to England mainly to negotiate publishing deals for Beethoven with Birchall. Because the tuning fork had been invented in 1711 by Handel and Purcell's trumpeter and also lutenist John Shaw. And Beethoven, who of course was a Handel freak, may well have known this. Don't forget that he not only said that Handel was his favourite composer, he was reading the scores of Handel's complete works which were sent to him by the Philharmonic Society on his deathbed. So perhaps the tuning fork might have been his gratitude to the country which he never visited. You remember in my first talk, I talked about these letters where Beethoven was discussing as a teenager whether he would go to Vienna or to Britain. He nearly came to Britain in 1792. Gratitude to his favourite composer, Handel, to Shaw for the tuning fork, to Bridgetower, perhaps even to the Regent. And of course, in 1825, George Smart would conduct the historic London performance of the Ninth Symphony, which the Philharmonic Society had commissioned 3 years earlier, but which they didn't get the premiere of. I thought they were always rather gracious about the fact they didn't get to premiere this piece they put all that money into. In that year, in the September of that year, Smart attended one of those workshop performances of Opus 132, which I've been talking about. These were organised by the Swiss publisher Schlesinger, who's going to publish Beethoven's late quartets, in the hotel in which he had his lodgings, the Hotel zum Wildenmann. And the following is reported. Now, this is always reported as being a demonstration of Beethoven's inability to play the violin, but wait for it. And just look at it kindly for a moment here. So, Smart reported a staccato passage not being expressed to the satisfaction of his eye, for alas, he could not hear. He seized hold of Holz's violin. So that's the second violin, because it was Schuppensieg, Holz, Weitz and Linker at this point, the fourth manifestation of what originally had been the Lobkowitz Quartet, then became the Razumovsky Quartet, then became the Schuppensieg Quartet. He seized hold of Holz's violin and played the passages about a quarter tone too flat. That's always talked about as, oh wow, he played the Beethoven. Now, how many composers who are not players can honestly pick up a violin and play any passages from a Beethoven late quartet at all? The fact was that Beethoven had not abandoned his manual relationship with the violin. I'm pretty impressed he played it anywhere close to being in tune. It was only a quarter tone too flat. He was able to demonstrate what he wanted. To the very end, this is within 18 months of him dying, he was able to do this. There's no suggestion that Beethoven could not play, just that he couldn't hear in order to play exactly in tune. And bear in mind that all the way back, Gerhard von Breuning reported that his father Stefan reported about those early violin lessons with Franz Ries, that Beethoven's intonation was never the best. So this was perhaps not any different from where he was at the beginning, but he could still play. And this shows, if anything, this kind of brings me to everything I want to say of all of these three talks, that Beethoven had kept the workshop door wide open. At no point does he become the composer who sits at a distance from the musicians and waits them to do it and does the composer angry face until they get it right. He was always ready to leap in and demonstrate, even if it didn't sound good. He was, if you like, the door was wide open. And his relationship, right back to those first violin lessons with all the people we've been talking about, Roventini, the impact of Maltiotti through to the first lessons in his teens with Franz Ries, through lessons with Krumpholz and Schuppanzig until he stopped violin lessons probably around about 1801, stayed with him. He always remained somebody who saw himself as a string player as well as a keyboard player. And for me as a player, that is something which helps me find my way in, if you like. So that's what I have for today. I'd love to know if there are any thoughts, because some of you have been for everything, some of you haven't. So any reactions from anybody? I'd love to know what your feelings are about this.
I don't think you mentioned the frequency of the bridge tower tuning fork.
That's
Is nobody allowed to bang it?
I wasn't allowed to bang it. I sat there in the museum. They told me I wasn't allowed to bang it. How can you imagine how frustrating that was? And someone was hovering over me, going, "No, stop!" Because of course I'm a musician. My first instance is to bang something. What's the point of it? It's a piece of blued steel. What possible? So I'm going to have another go. But it was about this size. It was a little earlier than this. So I would be surprised if it was anything apart from Philharmonic pitch. And of course, it's worth remembering that the whole idea that pitch was lower all over Europe was an invention of the pitch varied up and down everywhere, and then the British came down lower than the rest of Europe, so we found its way around. I wish you hadn't asked that question because I couldn't do it, and I was hoping nobody would call me on that one. But Clive, thank you. Exactly, but yes, but exactly. That's your instinct is absolutely right. In all of these things, we need to always try them. We need to. So many of the answers to things which musicologists spend hours agonizing about can be answered if you try things. I'm a great fan of the historian ethnologist Elizabeth Wayland Barber, who's written a great book called Women's Work: The First 10,000 Years. She's an amazing writer, and she began her work as a young archaeologist working in the 1950s. It's in her late 80s now. When she realized that she would go to digs in Central Asia, and all the archaeologists, every time they got weaving weights, the weights which went to control, where you put on the end of when you're weaving to counterbalance the strands, the archaeologists would just chuck them over their shoulders into a pile. And then when they discovered a dress, she said, "Well, are we going to make a replica so we can try wearing it?" And they was greeted with total consternation. The idea that something could be learnt through inhabiting something was so contrary to the experience until she got into it. And if you think of it, I think it's a problem for a lot of us who are players and composers, that a lot of the writing about Beethoven is kind of at this kind of distance. It reviews it as either of, this, it's almost as if they're working with the idea of him as being alienated, which he wasn't, even however much he talked about it. He always was more with people than practically anybody I know. And the most important thing is that every single person who's ever picked up an instrument here will have learned something about a composer from what happens when you either draw a bow, put down a key, or you blow through it. It's absolutely vital. Anything else?
I have a question, if I may.
Please, Jennifer. Yes.
Hi, I'm in Vancouver here.
Great to see you.
Thank you. I'm just out for a walk, so I won't turn on my camera. But I teach intermediate pianists. Maybe they're working on the Opus 49 and Opus 79 sonatas.
Yeah.
And I coach some intermediate violinists. You know, they might be doing Spring Sonata.
Exactly, yeah.
Or a movement of an early trio. How can I incorporate this knowledge into my pedagogy? These have been fascinating lectures. Thank you.
I think the most important thing is that, for instance, if you were to, a simple thing would be anybody, if you show them, for instance, any of Beethoven's handwriting on the page, for instance, the things I was talking about in the last talk about how his handwriting reflects the music, the sensitivity. So if you're talking to a string player, for instance, say they are playing this. The slow motion of the Spring Sonata. Then if they see, and I think I've had experience with quite young children seeing this, you see the look of the pen when Beethoven is tracing a slur around those notes, and you ask the question of, what does it feel like to play it? What does the bow feel like in your hand as you play it? And what's the relationship of that to the sound you're making and Beethoven's own imagination as expressed by the pen on the paper? That will be one way of doing it. In my experience, young people are very, very ready to talk about visual stimuli, for instance. Most of these things you can easily... I've left bits of Beethoven's manuscripts on the resource page. It would just be fascinating to see the reaction. So that might be one way of doing it. And the other thing to say is, say with regard to the Opus 1 piano trios that you're talking about, that Beethoven did not see a piece which he wrote, whether or not he called it a sonatina, for instance, or whether it is seen as a classical piece. It's, even though the notes might seem like they're easier, he invested just as much care in them. And I know I was lucky that when I was introduced to these pieces, I was introduced to them as being, it's so exciting, you're going to do this. You're going to become part of this. So I think actually inviting them to realize there's nothing lesser about what they're doing. They're taking part in this dialogue with this man. No artist ever expressed better the, should we call it the intimate grandeur of humanity? You don't need to use that word with regard to a young person. And it's right there from the beginning. I remember playing Opus 1, number 1, which is the first time I experienced the Rinforzando around the second subject of that, learning how that kind of leaning happened, that door into Beethoven. So that might be one way. That's probably unbelievably unhelpful, but I wonder if that helps.
No, that's great. And I think that having them see that sensitive motion will really help. And I thank you very much. It's been fascinating, and you've done some fantastic research.
Thank you very much. Anything else? So we're nearly out of time. So.
I'd like to... Oh.
Yep. Rama, go.
Hi. First of all, I'd just like to just remind delight at the thought of Beethoven potentially on his deathbed leafing in delight through Handel. I really enjoyed that image. Along the same train of thought with pedagogy, you did mention in your first lecture this Enlightenment idea of education as a reward, lessons as a reward for group play. This feels as if it's on the same level of pragmatism as something that you mentioned today with Beethoven having two audiences for his works and the relationship that he had with his publishers, the fake manuscripts that he made. I don't understand why those two things are connecting in my mind, and perhaps you can explain.
I think I understand what you're getting at, which is the idea that that inversion, the idea that comes originally from people like Rousseau and then through Stéphanie de Genlis, the idea that play and learning are intersecting with each other. And perhaps the fact of the matter is, say if you take a piece which you could say was a Styriozo piece, the Opus 95 on the one side, and you take a piece which exists in the opposite world, written which perhaps, say we've just been hearing about the Opus 49s or the Opus 79 or the Opus 119s, for instance, or the Opus 33 bagatelles, going back to those. The fact that within all this simplicity, Beethoven is using that spirit of play, the spirit of easiness, the spirit of the word we've been using, invented by the generation before him, naturalness, to access something profound, which you have to work very, very hard to get to through intellect. So, for instance, if you think of something like... or even more... What's amazing about that is that what's being essayed there is profoundly simple. It's the kind of thing which a child has far less trouble singing than we do playing. We're back in the old adage about Mozart being too easy for amateurs and too difficult for professionals. But that's that kind of gyro-like intersect, which I think is where you're coming from. And I get, to a degree, what you're talking about is a sensation more than an idea. But I think as musicians, that's often what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a kind of sense of something. We know it when we feel it. We know it when we play it. We know it when we taste it. But we can't put it into words, and thank goodness we can't, because it's music and it's not a thesis, you know. I have a feeling somebody else was trying to say something. Rama got in there first. James. Mike, can't hear you. Can't hear you. Can't hear. Something weird's going on. Can't hear. Oh, no. Write it. Type. Type quickly. Go fast. Just no pressure. That's very weird. He's got the same microphone I'm using. He's asking another question first. While we're waiting for James, anything else? He's going to type. Kathleen, yes.
Yeah, I echo everybody's thanks to you for this. It's just so inspiring and so incredible. I'm so intrigued by what you're talking about, the people from Paris that have influence on Beethoven and on Beethoven's writing. There are those that theorize that, pardon my French, I don't speak French, but the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, that his playing and his writing actually had a big impact, in particular on the harp quartet.
Yes,
Do you have any?
Well, I'm Chevalier de Georges. Everyone is very excited about at the moment. I get that. He's very interesting. There's no mention of Chevalier de Georges at any point in any of Beethoven's output, of course. He comes from this very particular. In many ways, his training is pre-revolutionary. So that's the generation who were Viotti disciples around people like Cartier. I would say that absolutely what you're seeing in the harp quartet is very much French. So, for instance, that kind of that figuration. It's worth saying that if I can just take this back to Rode for a minute, because that kind of helps us a little bit. If I go to, I was going to try to go to it, but I can't see it now. Yes, here. So just to help you with, so if I go back to what happens in the Rode Air Verrier. So you have everything from these lyrical things to the kind of Viotti bowing. These kind of cross bowings to the kind of thing you're talking about. That stuff where these what I always call required elements figure skating bowings, basically. If the bits of skating which nobody watches at the Olympics, where the skaters have to go across the ice doing a series of combinations without music or anything. What was unique, and I use the word with temerity, about Parisian audiences was just as much as in their appreciation of poetry, they were incredibly attuned to the refinements of rhetoric and wit as they overlaid each other. So a Parisian audience listening to someone improvise poetry would applaud a deftly turned Alexandrine or something like that. The same thing is there with the audiences who'd been trained initially from the generation of Rameau onwards And you see, whenever a musician goes and works in Paris, think of Mozart's delight when he manages to get an audience to applaud in the place he wants in the 31st Symphony. He's so pleased he went and gave himself an ice cream. You know, there was a sense that the Parisian audience listened at an incredibly high level. And I think that's kind of what the difference, if there's one difference between string playing and piano playing, pianists don't kill me. It's that pianists don't naturally do combination of articulation because you can do simple things, but doing these kind of complex things are not a thing which you can naturally do on a keyboard. But when you have a keyboard next to the violin, then it finds its way in. Of course, the big figure behind all of this is Viotti, this incredible resource of, dare I call it, a combination of literary and expressive demands on the instrument. He sets the bar so high. So the Chevalier Scienziato, of course, there's the other element, of course, what he shared with Tartini was that he was a professional swordsman. Of course, he ran a fencing school in Soho. You know, well, Tartini had actually, he'd earned money as a young man and ended up having to go hide for a couple of years because he killed somebody in a duel. But this is going to get so nerdy, I apologize for this, which is the crucial change in string technique which happens in the 18th century can be expressed as to whether or not the arm is held here in the right hand or whether it's there. The place that came from can be witnessed over the previous 100 years in the very first physical how-to books which attempt and succeed in describing the body moving in three-dimensional space. That's not ballet, because until well into the 19th century, choreography showed the movements of the feet on the floor. However, fencing manuals, right back to the late 1500s, showed the body in motion in a sphere, a three-dimensional Vitruvian man. And this is, at the very least, if you think of the impact, Tartini would have studied those manuals. The Chevalier Saint-Georges would have studied those manuals. Suddenly, we start thinking like this. And I think that, in terms of the idea of what's being seen in a player and the feeling of being able to operate here, and of course, here's the crucial thing. What do men stop wearing? Men stopped wearing corsets in the 18th century. Women stopped later. But of course, the idea of the body untrammeled, like that, is vital to this. That's an incredibly convoluted answer, and it's just me going on a ridiculous stream of consciousness, and I wish I'd not said it. But can you see where I'm coming from? Okay, yes, we have, James, the simple answer to how the Bridge Tower Cadenza survived is because he wrote them in his copy of the music. We have his surviving copy of that. Really, why did he go to the effort to write it down? You've asked a really good question, which is subsequent performances after he met Beethoven. The first thing is that we know that he played it more than once with Beethoven because the bit I didn't read out says that I know it from memory, in performances of the Andante, audiences loved Beethoven's chaste playing so much they insisted he repeated the theme again. So we know there are multiple performances. The second question, yes, of course. Yes and no. The longer turret bow, this is kind of what's going on right now. There's a lot of research going on about the length of bows on both sides of the Alps away from France. There's lots of bows dating from the early 1800s in both Italy and in Austria, which are longer than a turret bow. For instance, in the Palazzo, got to get this right, the Palazzo Tursi in Genoa is the broken fragments of a Paganini bow, which he seems to have had before he left the Italian peninsula, which he did for the first time in 1828. And it's about 1.5 inches longer than a modern bow. And if you look at the drawing which Angra did of Paganini in Rome in 1818, the beautiful drawing where it's the only picture of Paganini which doesn't show his profile, this glorious classical full-face thing, probably drawn at the house of the Austrian ambassador, Kaunitz. Paganini is holding in his hands, certainly looks like the frog of a bow which is a bit turretish, and that looks to me very much like the broken bow in the Palazzo Tursi, it's enormously long. What's interesting is when you play one of these long bows for any period of time, you get the most extraordinary strain in your upper arm. Playing a really, really long bow, staccato on the violin is exhausting. Ola Bull had a bow like this as well. The string bow technology is developing all over the place. We know, as I said, that the early versions of the Tourt bow were coming back to Vienna. Mozart seems to have had one early Tourt, but it's worth also mentioning that all the Tourt family were busily remodeling bows as they went. And I work quite regularly on one Tourt bow, which was clearly made in the 1770s, which he remade and spliced new bits into as the technology changed. So one of the things was that by the time Berlioz, exasperated, finds himself writing his memoirs, everybody's using the most ridiculous and motley variety of instrument technology. So by, say, 1830 or 1831, the premiere of the Symphonie Fantastique, any orchestra in Europe wasn't just a motley of wind instruments which drove him crazy. Every single instrumentalist was using different technology. And the way I like to illustrate this is that in 1831, as I said this right weeks ago, when Paganini gave his debut in London, there was at least one cellist in the orchestra who had played in the Bach Arbel concerts in 1765 in London. And these people tended to hold on to their instruments. People didn't tend to change. So you have this fantastic thing of technologies going one way, and as I've said before, Paganini resisted the new technology. He actually kind of pushed it back. He didn't convert the fingerboard of the Canone to a modern slope fingerboard till 1828 in Vienna. It's the same fingerboard tilted back by a maker called Savitsky. So it's all over the place. But yes, I would agree that, yes, the Opus 96, yes, demands that to play it, and he would have known Rode was bringing that. Yes, you can clearly say that he's expecting that to happen. It's a really great question. Okay, before we finish, because I want to let Sky go, anything else before we go? In which case, I will like to thank you all for being with me. It's been incredibly inspiring, and to return to this in the course of a week. I think there's a number of people in the room I've discussed Beethoven with, and their excitement and their passion for Beethoven, and I have a degree of fear about it because I know that I'm stepping on something which is all of ours. He's not common property. He's like, we are his children in so many ways. So I go where angels fear to tread. But thank you very much, and hope to see you in the future at another one of these. So I'm going to hand back to Sky. Thank you very much.